Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to those of you joining us from different parts of the globe. A warm welcome from the European Council on Foreign Relations and the Middle East and North Africa program. My name is Ellie Geranmayeh. I'm the Deputy Director of the MENA program, and we are delighted to bring together a great discussion group today on Iraq, and in particularly to unpack a new report on Iraq, and particularly the relationship with Europe, to discuss with our esteemed panelists. Let me take this opportunity to do a brief introduction of our panel today. We have Professor Toby from the London School of Economics. We have Maria Fantappie, Special Advisor at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. And we have Sajad Jiyad, who's the author of ECFR'S latest report on Iraq, Torn Between Two Allies, How Europeans Can Reduce Iraqi Dependence on Iran and the US, which is available on the ECFR website. Our panel today has been watching and working on Iraq and European relations for a very long time now. So we are very thankful to them for taking time out to join us. There are folks in the Zoom meeting room today and others watching on Facebook live stream. So a warm welcome to you all. A quick note on the format. We are on the record, and this is meant to be a conversation style, interactive discussion and debate between us all. So for those of you who are in the Zoom room, please feel free to use the Q&A function to submit your comments or questions, and we will weave this through to the conversation. And for those of you who are on Facebook live stream, please similarly feel free to use the comment section to submit any questions you would like to submit to the group. So let's kick off the conversation by a quick assessment of where we are at today, particularly a few months now into the premiership of the new Iraqi Prime Minister, al-Khatami, who has more or less, some would say, settled into the role. I would put a question mark next to that. We've seen Iraq go through a very turbulent year so far, starting off with a huge escalation between Iran and the United States, which has thankfully reduced in its intensity over the last few months. We've also had Iraq coming out of months and summers of protests, which have really torn the society and the debate in the country in different places. And we now have Iraq's economy and political class struggling with the management of COVID, like many others, both in the region and elsewhere. So Sajad, let me come to you first, if I could, since we're here to debate your paper. You identified several key challenges for Iraq's new prime minister, looking at precedent and where developments are taking Iraq. Can you take us through what you identify as your top three challenges for the coming months ahead for the Prime Minister?
Thank you, Ellie. I think the Prime Minister faces not the challenges, crises, to be honest with you. I think some of these are insurmountable because they have been there for many years. And I don't think Khatami himself will be able to resolve them. I think the best we can hope for is that he will stabilize somewhat and prevent Iraq's collapse. And I think the way things are at the moment, whoever comes into the job after Khatami and perhaps 2-3 successors down the line will probably face the same kind of crises that he's facing, because some of these are systemic. So we're looking at the domestic challenges and the external challenges. From the domestic, we're looking at the issues obviously around COVID, which we hope will be temporary. It won't last more than the next 2 years, but we also know that Iraq's health system is dilapidated. So trying to recover the infrastructure side of things with health will take us, well over this decade. Then we're also looking at the fact that Khatami is here at the head of a temporary government. He lacks a political base. He's not a member of a party, yet he's trying to reform the system by bringing about a change to the electoral law, by making sure that early elections do happen on time, by trying to rein in some of the political forces who have armed wings and militias and so on attached to them. And I think that's a very sensitive challenge for him. He lacks some of the power to do this by himself. It requires the willingness of parties, requires the determination by the political elite themselves to allow some sort of reforms to occur. And then we're looking at the issues around the resurgence or potential resurgence of ISIS in northern Iraq, and the security challenges that presents if Iraq manages to see out in the next couple of years a departure of the coalition and fails to agree new agreements either with NATO or a successor to the coalition to ensure longer term support for its military and security forces. And I think that's something that Prime Minister Kadhimi is especially concerned about. And then finally, we're looking at the challenge that he faces from the tensions, as you mentioned, between the US and Iran being played out in Iraq, the link Iran has to armed groups inside Iraq, the willingness of the US to go after Iran, not in Iraq, but inside Iraq, and obviously the challenges around sanctions and the rising tensions in Syria, Lebanon, and elsewhere. So when you put all these together, the fact that they're going on at the same time, and Kadhimi is the head of the temporary government, it doesn't inspire a lot of confidence that these will be resolved very quickly. And as I say, what we're looking for probably is stability through the end of his term, which may end in June. It may, go on for several months after. But I don't think we can expect dramatic developments in a positive way anytime soon.
Thanks, Sajad. Maria, let me come to you because, we've been watching a lot of protests and calls for reforms inside Iraq that has shaped the debate among the political elite in the country. But there's also a established political system that is benefiting from the current status quo and is very much resisting any flows of reforms that Kadhimi and others may be trying to introduce. What's your sense of how willing the political elite are open, and how willing are they for these reforms to take place? And how much opposition are they putting forward to the Prime Minister's agenda? Maria, we can't hear you at the moment. I don't know if it's just me, but still cannot hear you. Perhaps my colleagues can assist, unless other people can hear Maria, because I can't hear. So Maria, we'll come back to you. My colleagues will try and sort that technical issue out. Let me pause that question and go to Toby in that case. Toby, we were just talking about the state of the protests. One of the outcomes that came around over the summer has been a real intensification of the security situation on the ground. And you wrote a tribute in July, reflecting on your colleague and friend, Dr. Hisham al-Hashimi, who was murdered in cold daylight in Iraq. There's been a lot of internal events since then. And I wondered what you think that these recent developments over the summer signal about the degree of hard power opposition to Prime Minister Kadhimi and those who are trying to push, particularly for security sector reforms in the country. Over to you, Toby, and I hope we can hear you.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Perfect.
Excellent. Right. So firstly, I think we should congratulate Sajad on an excellent paper. It covers the key problems that Mustafa Kadhimi, but also the Iraqi state and very sadly the Iraqi population face, and it covers them with both nuance and realism. I think it would be fair to say there is that Sajad can't in any way be accused of being either optimistic or idealist in his very accurate analysis of the situation. And I think, and the question you asked Maria is similar to the one you asked me, and it comes out very clearly in Sajad's paper, that you have a system that is empowered a relatively small number of players, the heads of the big parties and militias in Iraq. And then I think from October 2019 onwards, you've had a sustained protest movement against the system, against the key players, and against the corruption and sclerotic institutions that system has given rise to. Now, after October 2019, what we saw was the key players within that system unapologetically and unreservedly deploy violence to defend their role at the center of that. That was certainly not a state tools of state-controlled violence, but also informal and covert violence. All of our friend on this panel, Hisham al-Hashimi, was caught up in that. He was murdered, I think, for two reasons, two powerful reasons, possibly three reasons that we think centrally about. He was very close to the Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi and had been advising him for a long time, and they were friends. In murdering Hisham, I think those that murdered him were sending a clear message about what those who support the Prime Minister and his reform plan can face. Secondly, Hisham was a fearless and very astute researcher and was happy to highlight the corruption, the abuse of power at the center of the Iraqi state. And thirdly, he was murdered for an example to those fearless, I think, demonstrators, a lot of whom have also been murdered and kidnapped, who were protesting against the system. Now, since Hisham's untimely murder, there's been a lot of assassinations and a lot of kidnappings, a lot of brutality. And I think this is an ongoing struggle between a mobilized, largely youthful civil society that sees that they've not got much to gain from interacting with a system that has systematically failed them, and those that have been enriched by it who are very comfortable using violence to defend it. But in the middle, you have, as Sajad quite rightly says, Mustafa Kadhimi, the Prime Minister, who is who faces a profound dilemma. He is trying to become the vehicle to deliver on the aspirations for reform of the population. But he was put in place, empowered, supported, it could be removed by those very key systemic players who are using violence to defend their own interests within the system. And so from that, you see him moving back and forward, very good public relations, sometimes an attempt to do something that changes the dynamic of the system. But I don't think without mobilizing the population, without trying to be at one with the demonstrators, deploying the power of the street, that he's going to achieve anything, because the vested interests are so entrenched, are so determined, and are so ruthless.
Thank you very much, Toby. Maria, let's bring the conversation back to you, because I think we can hear you now. Perfect. Let's take the conversation from where Toby left it, about this dilemma that the Iraqi Prime Minister faces. In your assessment, what can we reasonably expect from his administration going forward? I mean, he's been engaged not only in internal conversations, but also with external players. Where would you pinpoint as the one key area that we may be able to have some constructive movement from his administration in the coming months or year ahead?
Well, first of all, I hope you can hear me now. Yes. Bringing back the discussion also on your first question and on the willingness really of this political class to bring about change. The answer to your question, I think that there is no will from the political system as such to bring change, because this dysfunctional machine of which they have been part, it has been benefiting them. However, I would say that it has been also a machine that has also been seen the participation of certain segment of the society. So we cannot just, I think, frame the debate of saying, okay, there is like a society against political leadership. I think that there is a problem, there has been a problem of political culture within this political class, which reflects also the Iraqi society at a certain point of its history. Now, I think with this new generation of activists that Toby mentioned, we can see that the society is pushing back. There is a youthful movement that say, I don't want to be part of that dysfunctional culture. This does not bring any prospect for me, and therefore we need to change. Therefore, the light at the end of the tunnel that I that I see is precisely in this generational shift, which does not necessarily come only with new leaders coming at the top with the new elections or younger leaders. It's not about having younger people on top of the institution. I would say that it's really more about this bottom-up change that brings different value in Iraqi politics, value in the first place of citizenship, for instance. And this issue of the citizenship, it has been at the really fundamental core of the protest movement. Therefore, we're talking about really generational shifts that requires a lot of time. And I think that the approach as analysts that we must have while looking at this, it's this, what also Sajad and Toby both have mentioned, which is like really appreciating the graduality of it. We cannot expect quick changes, and we have therefore to also have moderate expectation because of what the Prime Minister can actually achieve. In the very short time frame that he has now, I think that already having a fair and free election will be a big achievement, because it will not only be the channel for bringing perhaps new voices within the political arena, but I see it more symbolically as that moment where this new value that this new generation is bringing are going to be actually being respected and heard.
Thank you very much, Maria, and for the caution on moderating our expectations. And I very much hear that as someone who's looking at the region at large. Sajad, let me come back to you, and let's broaden the conversation a bit beyond the facts on the ground and look at what's happening externally. One of the calls and demands that we've heard from the streets of Iraq over recent months and years has been a call for Iraqi sovereignty, and essentially a call for both Iran and the United States to moderate their approach towards the country. What is your sense about how Khatami and the governing elite are managing that careful balance between Tehran on the one hand and Washington on the other? This was one of the core focus areas for your paper. How have you sensed that progress as we've seen Iraqi engagement with both Washington in recent months and Tehran? Over to you, Sajad.
So I think we have to take note of the fact that Iraq does not have a unified foreign policy. It's made up of successive coalition governments who are essentially political rivals and enemies, and have, sometimes completely different political philosophies and attitudes, being forced to form a government, and then this government having a very disjointed foreign policy. So you'd have sometimes the prime minister at odds with his own foreign minister about what they believe to be their policy should be towards the US or Iran, and so on and so forth. I think there's a realization amongst the political elite that Iraq needs to be friends with Iran and the US. It cannot afford to lose either. And I think events over the last few years have shown that Iraq especially does not have much agency, unfortunately, in terms of trying to protect its sovereignty. And I think that's the first thing that Iraq should try to do, instead of relying purely on the US and Iran to resolve their issues, or for them to drive, as you say, some moderation towards Iraq. I think Iraq should try to reclaim some of this agency itself. It needs to force the political elite to sit down to agree on a foreign policy, and not for it to be undermined by their political differences. That this is something that Iraq as a country needs, and whatever political allegiances individual parties or parts of the elite have towards Iran or the US or Turkey or Europe or whatever, that shouldn't undermine the state as a whole. And unfortunately, that's what's been going on. Some of the key people in parliament, some of the key political elite have allegiances or very close ties or friendships with other countries at the cost of Iraq's sovereignty or interests. And until we change the situation, we're not going to really get out of this kind of this rut. And I think that's the first priority that any kind of government needs to have. The second, I would say, is that Iraq has done well so far in terms of engaging the US in the strategic dialogue. It needs to undertake a similar dialogue with Iran without having, a direct face-to-face conversation around all the issues that Iraq has with Iran. then we will just keep coming back to them in a kind of very behind closed doors, very quiet political salons where these are discussed, rather than having them in a formal face-to-face discussion. We need to talk about Iran's role in terms of supporting armed groups. We need to talk about, the issues around water and energy. We need to talk about the possibility of secondary sanctions and several other issues that Iraq faces with Iran. And unfortunately, I don't think there is enough political incentive so far for any of the Iraqi elites to do this. And until we change that situation, I think Iran will always have a bit more of a upper hand, let's say, in what goes on in Iran. The third thing I would say is we need a change in stance from the Americans towards Iran inside Iraq. As long as the Iranians feel that they can provoke the Americans, and as long as the Americans are willing to respond, then the situation is out of the Iraqi hands. As you can see, Iraqi forces are trying to stop these attacks on the U.S. embassy, on forces based in Baghdad airport and elsewhere. But they've been occurring, almost every day or every other day, and they don't seem to be capable of preventing these completely. At the moment, the U.S. is showing a bit of restraint, but it's not always the case. It wasn't the case earlier this year, and it wasn't the case last year. And I think the calculation of some of these forces and the calculation of Iran is waiting for the right time to provoke the U.S. to respond and hoping that will lead to a backlash against the U.S. And unfortunately, Iraq does not have, or doesn't seem to have, much of a role in stopping this cycle. So for the immediate short term, I think we need to engage Iran. Iraq needs to engage Iran in a dialogue. It needs to ensure as much as possible that the U.S. does not get drawn into, the proxy conflict inside Iraq. And the third thing is we need to have a unified foreign policy. At the moment, none of these three elements are there.
Thank you very much, Sajad. I want to come back to you later about how we might get to that more unified foreign policy. But Toby, let me come to you. Sajad mentioned the role of the US, and obviously Iraq has fallen prey to the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign against Iran in recent years, both on issues of security, political matters, and the economy. Without second guessing what the outcome of the US elections are going to be, I wondered whether you could just provide broad headlines for what you anticipate US foreign policy on Iraq looking like under a second Trump term, or indeed a Biden administration. Will we have more of the same, or will there be a major shift under either administrations in the White House? Over to you, Toby.
Well, thank you for that difficult question. But I think two things that have marked out Trump's foreign policy from the start of his first term is both inconsistency, but also a growing focus, if not obsession, on Iran. And I think Iraq, as Sajad was saying, has been both the arena that's been played out in and a lot of collateral damage. I think there was an argument to say that as tensions between Iran and the US rose, there was greater violence. And I think the assassinations of Mohandas and Soleimani show the absolute crudity and lack of risk assessment or strategic vision that the Trump administration can descend to. I assume if there was a second Trump term, it would be a balance between economic diplomacy, economic coercive diplomacy, greater sanctions, a pie in the sky wish that the Iranian regime will collapse, and then this uncalibrated use of violence when Trump sees fit. Now, the more interesting, the more intriguing question is if we get a Biden presidency. Biden, for worse and better, has a long policy experience on Iraq, but my working assumption about a Biden presidency would be it would be much more diffuse, that the key decision makers would be in the State Department, and he would have a much fuller front bench of foreign policy analysts and deciders that he would rely on. I think there would be an attempt to reforge a more balanced relationship with Iran, and I think that could help Iraq. But again, as Sajad was saying just now and in his paper, I think Iran has cultivated a long-term series of allies at the very highest levels of the Iraqi governing elite, but it is also very astutely deployed covert violence, the attacks on the supply convoys for the US diplomatic and military effort, the use of rockets. Now, would that dramatically end on the day that Biden were inaugurated? I don't think so. I think it would certainly be dialed down, and they would wait. And I think Iraq will continue to be the arena within which these contestations happen. I think I would celebrate Sajad's policy point that life for Iraqi sovereignty, the assertion of Iraqi sovereignty, would be much easier to come by if the ruling elite could find a consensus. But Sajad also said that the ruling elite are traditionally in competition. They can agree on very few things, on occasion the division of spoils from the state. So from that point of view, asking them, some of whom are very, very close to Iran, supported and funded by Iran, some of them are more distant and seeking to develop a comparative autonomy from them, asking them to agree on the assertion of a sovereignty vis-a-vis Iran would be much more difficult than the US, doing the same for the US, I think.
Thanks, Toby. So you outlined that there might be some degree of calm from calm if we're dealing with the Biden White House, but that Iraq will remain a central focus area where potentially clashes or deconfliction between Iran and the US may take place. Maria, let me come to you. So we've been looking at the external players now and Iraq's relations with these important players. But how do you think that the tensions between Iran and the US, particularly over the past year, have impacted the political space on the ground in Iraq to discuss reforms, to push forward the demands of the new generation, as you mentioned, on the streets for greater rule of law, transparency, reduction in corruption? How much has that tension between Iran and the US essentially sucked up the oxygen on the ground away from domestic political issues in your perspective?
Thank you, Ellie. Well, I think that the key issue here is the US maximum pressure against Iran and Iraq reforms are two competing goals. And the attempts of some US officials to sort of conflate these two, thinking that, for example, leveraging on the protest movement to undermine certain Iran allies in Iraq, or using the prime minister as a reformist in order to say that he is an anti-Iranian player, friend of the US. These things are actually backfiring on the very objective of achieving reform, because they are delegitimizing the prime minister as a figure who is representing a street movement in order to achieve what the street has demanded him to do. And instead, it's sort of locking and trapping the prime minister into a run for delivering result towards Washington in terms of how much he can crack down, for example, on the Fantappie, on the PMF, how much he can crack down on their economic networks. And of course, as much as he does that, it then trigger and ignite conflict within the country, because then he provokes, of course, other parts that are of the PMF who are actually responding, and therefore then he's caught basically into a domestic conflict, which does not allow him to have enough space within the political system, enough political support to really bring about reform and focus on the key issues that needs to be addressed. So I think that here comes also the important issue of having alternative partners for this government, which are not the US, because the more Kadami is sort of locked and trapped into this partnership, which is a special relationship that one with the United States, but definitely one which is in this context limiting him, the less he will be able actually to bring reforms, and the more it will be seen as a US supported prime minister, and the less as a sovereign Iraq prime minister.
Thanks, Maria. We're going to look at the role of diversifying Iraq's alliances and strengthening those shortly. Let me also, at this halfway point, welcome those of you who are on the Zoom call to do start submitting your questions. We're getting a few, which I'm going to start weaving in. And those of you on Facebook live stream, please do engage us through the comment sections, and we'll get your comments and questions on the floor. Sajad, let me come to you. We've just been looking at these tensions between Iran and the US. One specific question that I had that you explored in your paper, but I wondered now with some time whether you see the situation as having developed, is, you know, in January when the US carried out the assassination of Iran's IRGC commander, Qasem Soleimani, a lot of headlines focused in on the implications of that assassination. But there was also another very important consequence of that incident, which was also the killing of Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, and who had a very pivotal role in structuring the PMF forces, which successive Iraqi governments have attempted to bring under the umbrella of the state security apparatus. Can you take us through, in your perspective, where the PMF is now post-Mohandes in terms of its command and structure and coordination and obedience to that command structure? And what challenges are they posing at this point for Khatami? Over to you, Sajad.
Well, I think the change has been significant. The loss of Mohandes, I think he's irreplaceable for the PMF. And in terms of the players out there, I think they were all feeling that Mohandes is the one person that they cannot replace, because all of the PMF leaders are either rivals, maybe perhaps enemies, competitors, have different agendas, have different loyalties or different methods. Mohandes was seen to be above this. He was seen to be as a person who did not care for his specific unit or his specific brigade or whatever, but he actually cared for the PMF as an institution. He cared for them, maintaining their ability to project power inside the states and outside of it for many years to come. Whereas everybody else, Hamari or whoever, they're there only either for themselves as individuals or their specific units, Badr or whatever. And I think that's exactly what's happened since the loss of Mohandes. There's been a splintering among the PMF in terms of what they should do with regards to responding to the government, what they should do even in terms of approving a new PM. 2 prime ministers were nominated before Khatami, and they both failed. And part of the issue was the differences some of these groups held towards the nomination of the PM. And Khatami himself, a significant number of the PMF and parties allied with the PMF did not want Khatami to take up the post. And one significant opponent is Katab Hezbollah, who have been threatening Prime Minister Khatami for months now, accusing him of targeting them, accusing him of giving US support for the assassination against Soleimani Mohandes, accusing him of trying to wipe them out, essentially. And since then, I think they have managed to convince even more players inside the PMF that Khatami is a danger. And so when you have these questions being put forward and there is no cohesive view amongst the PMF, what should they do in terms of how they deal with Khatami or the state? I think that makes some of these groups potentially more dangerous and potentially more likely to act in a way that undermines the state. Now, the PMF has always been a bit of a challenge for the Iraqi state, no doubt about it. Even before 2017, while the war was going on with ISIS, you had groups being involved in Syria, which the Iraqi government did not approve, did not want to see them over there, but they were essentially fighting alongside Bashar al-Assad's forces. And the issue was always that this is something that the Iraqi state does not want to see, but had no real ability to stop. And so going forward, what kind of attitude will these groups have with the government if there is no unified leadership within themselves? And I think that's what the loss of Mohandes puts forward to us. Going forward, I think the Iraqi government does not have a specific policy in terms of what to do with the PMF. I think they're thinking about rule of law in general. They're thinking about how to make the security forces more cohesive, but I don't think they have a specific policy that answers the question, what should we do with the PMF? I just don't think that's there. The second part of this is that the PMF is not just militant groups. The PMF has, you know, a lot of involvement in society, has charitable wings and foundation, has political allies in parliament who make up, you know, significant parts of the largest bloc in parliament, who from now I cannot see being sidestepped in terms of forming the next government or the next prime minister, who I cannot see suddenly losing lots of votes and not, you know, retaining a significant number of their seats in parliament, who I think will still be the kingmakers in Iraqi politics. So, you know, you have the PMF as a military group with their capabilities. You have then their ability to be involved socially, and they do have support. We can't deny that. They're not, you know, people who are completely disconnected from Iraqi society. That's not true. They have representatives amongst the people, and they do have support amongst a large number of people. And then they also have the political power as well. So how do you deal with that from a government that is temporary, that essentially has a prime minister without any political constituency trying to take this on? It's impossible. So I think with time, the Iraqi government needs to develop a policy working with the PMF to say, right, what does the future look like? The PMF has its vision of the future, which probably doesn't work for the Iraqi state, but the Iraqi state also cannot go completely maximalist and zero sum. It cannot demand, you know, suddenly the PMF to just, you know, disband. That's not on the table. That's not going to happen. Nor can the status quo continue, because it undermines the Iraqi state. So there has to be a degree of pragmatism. There has to be a degree where we look at also the wishes of some of the people in the PMF. Not everybody inside the PMF is completely happy with the way the PMF is conducting itself. We've seen several groups, and they're largely affiliated with the shrines in Iraq and with the Marja'iyya and Najaf of Ayatollah Sistani, who've actually moved out of the PMF, and they've moved formally into the Ministry of Defense. And they completely, you know, have been completely transparent that they are critical of the PMF and its leadership. And they are more in support of actually coalescing around the MOD and in a way, disbanding the PMF from the traditional sense that we see it today. And I think that's potentially some ground for the Iraqi government to explore. How many more people inside the PMF, how many more groups are unhappy and want to see a change up in its leadership and its objectives?
Thank you very much, Sajad. Toby, let me put one of the questions we've had from our guests to you. We've talked about these divisions and tensions within Iraqi political elite over different issues. One big player in the system we haven't really touched on is the role of the Kurdistan regional government. Do you see the KRG as being able to play a constructive role in helping Baghdad come out of this current internal tensions, particularly whether it's with the PMF or between the US and Iran on foreign policy and domestic issues? Do you see a specific role for them?
I think traditionally the two dominant parties within the Kurdish regional government, the KDP from Erbil and the PUK from Sulaymaniyah, have overtly pursued an independent foreign policy. They've tried to leverage their relationship with Washington, to some extent their relationship with London, to try and gain greater power against Baghdad. And I think that goes on. Its ambition has been blunted because of the aftermath of the referendum for independence and the crushingly low oil price and the financial crisis that the KRG finds itself in, as with the rest of Iraq. But I would say that there are still quite profound tensions between, especially the KDP in Erbil and Baghdad, and groups within Baghdad that's around the Ministry of Finance. A just and balanced deal look like? A budgetary wages support the Kurdish regional government in a bigger financial hole than Baghdad, and that's saying something. And what do we get in return? And I don't see any vehicle at the moment to sort that out. Now, the previous prime minister and the current prime minister were overtly and proudly very pro-KRG, sympathetic to the KDP and the PUK, but I don't see that in the past or in the future will deliver the grand compromise and the trust and open transparency dealing needed to bring the two together, and for the KRG to play a positive role in national politics and in Baghdad. I think they're still very much fixated on maximizing their own interests, whether that be in parallel to Baghdad's interest or directly against them.
Thanks, Toby. Maria, so a complicated picture on the KRG's front, ability to move the needle on the ground. We've had a couple of questions which focus in on the same issue, which is essentially, have the street protests that we've seen in Iraq really had concrete impact on the ground, whether that's in terms of waking up some of the ruling elite of the necessity for reforms, pushing for certain political figures to essentially switch sides, as they say, to join and support the movements on the streets. And a second layer is, you know, Sajad talked about the complexities involved with the PMF and their relationship with various forces. But one of the calls that we heard from protesters on the street was also for restrictions on the roles of these groups in terms of their control over the security and the monopolization of the use of power. Do you see the Hashid particularly having changed, or perhaps Iran having moderated their position in recent months vis-a-vis their relationship with these groups? So really we're looking at whether there has been any concrete impact from these protests on the state of play in Iraq.
Well, there is an impact to the extent that, as I said in my first response, there is a sort of a push from the bottom of the society, which forced the political establishment to actually respond to a certain extent. And there, I mean, the resignation of Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi, it's, I would say, the first sign that there has been actually an impact. So measures have been taken. Now, from that to say that we will have a new brown political class coming, emerging with the election next year, I don't think that we will. Because there are several obstacles to it, not only the issue of the election law, but also really the issue related to the internal organizations within the protest movement. I think that one of the biggest problem within all these street movements, really in the wider sense, also reaching also beyond Iraq, is that they're definitely politically driven, in the sense that there is aims political aim to achieve, but at the same time they're not really politically organized, because there are different souls in within, which is perfectly fine. At the same time, I think that the protest movement will continue to impact Iraq political leadership in two levels. One will be that one of participating into the election next year, and the second one will be to continue to be an element of pressure on the political leadership, but while staying outside the system. Because also we have seen how dangerous it is when some of the protests are actually organized and participate into the political process. Sometimes the political process actually push them to or force them to be what to behave and to be to not be any more focused on actually on those aims that they wanted to achieve. And so it's actually drifting them away from those goals that they first promoted. On this, your second point in terms of whether the PMF it's behaving differently, I think that unfortunately the answer is that we see an escalation on the ground in terms of targeted attack on civic activists, and I think that what is happening is that precisely because the PMF is not an institution, in the sense it's not one agency, but is a network that branches off and reaches also civilian agency, and is not only deployed or employed into military or security affairs. Then of course you have also a lot of entities operating in within, and specifically after the death of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, you have a sort of incoherence that has emerged within the movement. And so it's even more difficult actually for the different factions to coordinate on how to behave. And therefore we see that this sort of splintering and divisions are actually encouraging a more disorganized approach also on how they behave in front of the issue of the protest, and also on how to behave in front of the issue of the US. So you have more and more factions who are taking on their own initiatives to, for example, launch attacks or to have targeted operation on civic activists. And I think that unfortunately this increases rather than decreases the challenges for the government to put an end to this.
Thank you very much, Maria. So on that quite complicated, rather bleak landscape domestically, Sajad, let me come to you for, part of the heart of your paper was looking at the role that Europe can have on pushing the momentum in a more constructive direction, particularly in relation with the role that external players are playing in Iraq, but also in terms of pushing forward stabilization, some of the economic reform policies on the ground. Can you provide us with some of your key takeaways and findings in the paper in terms of the role that European countries and the EU more broadly could play in Iraq going forward?
So I've suggested why Europe should actually care about Iraq and why it should be involved. And it boils down essentially to three parts. The first of which is that a destabilized Iraq is bad for the Middle East. It will lead to tensions in other countries and potentially splitting out violence elsewhere. And this is something that the EU wants to avoid. The second is that destabilization in Iraq will unfortunately lead to migration, and that's something some of the EU countries want to avoid. And the third is also the issue of terrorism, whether it's ISIS in Iraq or cells that ISIS has throughout Europe, leading to domestic terrorism in Europe as well. Now, of course, some of the feedback I've received on that is that this is essentially blackmail. You're saying that if Europeans don't do enough to help in Iraq, then suddenly Iraq is going to essentially allow its problems to, go all the way to Europe. And this isn't something that's very positive for Europe. It's not enticing. It's not an enticing offer. It's blackmail. And I would say that this is something that Europeans themselves need to consider. How much are they willing to do in Iraq? What is the cost they're willing to put forward for their involvement? Because whatever they do, there will be costs, and it's not just financial, and it's not just in terms of their domestic audience, in terms of political capital and so on. It is also the possibility of coming into conflict with the US in terms of policy. It is the potential of being caught in the crossfire between the US and Iran. There is the potential for change in politics to impact the Europeans, the nature of their relationships with the individual Iraqi players, for example. And another question, so what are the Europeans willing to do? What is the price they're willing to pay for their role inside Iraq? And I don't think they've identified that. The suggestions essentially revolve around, and some of these have been said before, revolve around conditioning some of the aid that they present to Iraq in terms of not just presenting aid for humanitarian purposes, but actually trying to improve the performance of government, trying to give experience to the Iraqi system to improve its governance. And some of that comes through money, but I don't think that's what Iraq actually needs. I think more of it is just knowledge transfer. I think it's working with parts of the state to improve its performance. I think it's giving confidence to some parts of local government as well to try to do a better job. And of course, that means you need to work with the political powers in the country, which includes the prime minister and the parties in parliament. And without that, I think if the Europeans try to sidestep that, they will find that their projects are just going to be small, temporary, based on humanitarian aid, and actually don't lead to improving the system of governance or the issues that Iraq faces in terms of trying to provide services for citizens. And unfortunately, that's what's been the focus up until now. And I'm not saying it's not an important issue. We have to find solutions for the humanitarian side of things. That's an absolute priority. But also, we cannot neglect the fact that we've been here before. Europeans have been throwing money at the humanitarian solution for many, many years. And every time there is more violence in the country or destabilization, we come back to the same problem. So certainly there is a problem with what has happened post-2003, with the ability of the country to govern itself. And until the Europeans realize this, and the fact that other countries can sometimes play a destabilizing role, like the US, certainly as Iran has been accused of as well, that the Europeans, whatever money, whatever aid they give, will always end up, essentially just as a band-aid solution. It's not really going to help Iraq long term. So I think that's something the Europeans need to consider, that their partnership with Iraq needs to be focused long term, beyond the life cycle of a parliament or a political party in power in Europe somewhere. It needs to go for many, many years, because Iraq's problems are not going to be resolved in just a short amount of time.
Thank you, Sajad. Maria, let me come to you with a similar question on the role of Europe. You've spent time as a strategic advisor to the European Union on Iraq. And, you know, we've had a summer where we've seen, for example, President Emmanuel Macron going to Iraq with a new plan for bolstering Iraqi sovereignty through the energy sector space in particular. We've also had successive statements from the European Union, the Foreign Affairs Committee, about the need to bolster Iraqi sovereignty and assist Iraq further. What are some of your practical takeaways from your time within the system about where the European Union and its member states could go, you know, in the immediate future in terms of assisting Iraq in this very delicate phase? And let's remember also here that we're dealing with a country that's coming out of bombardment after the ISIS coalition campaign that really hasn't been addressed or resolved yet. Over to you, Maria.
Yes. First of all, definitely, as Sajad said, we have to focus on the positive contribution that the EU can have. Let me elaborate at least on a couple of points. The first one is the role that the EU can have, not necessarily as mediator of the US-Iran competition in Iraq. I think that role, it cannot probably have it, but it can have a role of its own in, for instance, enabling the rapprochement between Iraq and its neighbors. This rapprochement also between Iraq and GCC country has been something that already during the Mogherini mandate we have been seeing that the EU has invested in, and I think that like shifting a bit the focus from solely the JCPOA lens and going more towards Iraq and regional politics, I think it will be beneficial, will bring more results, because eventually we know that there is still a lot of divisions between EU member states on how they should deal with the US-Iran competition. There is still the sort of debate that is haunting the EU since 2003 between the Atlantists and the Europeanists. So those one who, some member states who want to sort of give priority to EU member state as members also of NATO, and others who actually wants more to have a European line. I think that still that division this is not overcome, and therefore I think that the EU should really search for its own niche beyond that, and I think that the positive initiative should be to really continue down the road of seeing Iraq, of investing in Iraq's sovereignty, investing into the initiative of Iraq and its neighbors, and shifting the lens really from thinking of looking at Iraq through the Iran lens. The second thing, it's the second issue that I think could be positive, is that EU member states have been very much focusing on a common approach. They have found a common approach, at least on principles that they agree on Iraq. They haven't necessarily reached a joint political union, let's say, towards Iraq, but at least they have agreed on common principle, and the Iraq's EU-Iraq strategy has been a testimony of it. So I think that there is a lot to build on these common principles that they have stated. Until now, we have seen that the EU have rather sort of focused on the principle, but they have been less active on translating this principle on effective on-the-ground initiatives. I think that, on the contrary, those principles that are like fair election, support of fair election, support of issues like environment, gender, all these elements that are already part of the protest movement, for example, there is a lot of space in there for establishing a small project, not necessarily big projects, but small projects which are, again, led by few well-informed people on the ground and which can have direct impact on the beneficiaries. I think that there is, for the EU, over the last 18 years, since 2003, there has been too much of also funding that has been sort of delegated to other agencies such as the UN. And I think that the EU has a lot to give in terms of, on the contrary, setting up a smaller project which have really direct impact on the beneficiary, especially that now there is a lot of space with the protest movement really to invest on issues that are at the core of the EU values, such as environment, gender, fair election. On the issue of the fair elections, for example, one positive development is the stepped up role of the EU Parliament into foreign policy affairs. During the last meeting between the High Representative Borrell and Fouad Hussein, the foreign minister, one thing that have been discussed is precisely the opportunity of sending EU observers for the next election. I think that this, for instance, is one of these small projects, small things that could be easily implementable and could be and could have really a good impact on the EU image. As for the last point, I will say, even if there is no possibility to have a political agreement among all the EU member states on the EU, on difficult issues specifically related to Iran's role in Iraq, I think that there is a space for core group initiatives of EU member states, for instance, on protection of civic activists. And we have seen already that the member states have united in some of these occasions already on publishing statements denouncing violence on civic activists. So I think that we should continue on these core group initiatives that, even if they are not necessarily representing the entire EU member state, but at least they are giving political messages that are important for the EU role in Iraq.
Thank you very much, Maria. Great baskets of ideas there. Toby, let me come to you for some final concluding remarks, because we've talked a lot about the EU and its member states, less so about the United Kingdom, given its historic footprint in Iraq and the special relationship with the United States. Just wondered where you see the UK as standing in terms of its future partnership with Iraq, and perhaps a very small footnote in terms of where you see some of the leading GCC actors, particularly the UAE and Saudi Arabia, as heading towards their relationship with Iraq in the forthcoming months ahead. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, ironically, given that the UK is about to leave the European Union, or it has left the European Union, sorry, I would put UK foreign policy in Iraq against the background of its relationship with the EU. I think the EU's profile in Baghdad has risen. Sajad was saying it needs to spend its money more strategically. I would agree with that. But boy, compared to a lot of other people, it has got a lot of money to spend. And I think with that comes the ability to project influence. That would be the first thing. I think the US embassy in Iraq, for security reasons, as well as a lot else, is an absence presence. It's got that huge building. And so both, but not many people come out of it much. So from that point of view, you've got both the EU and the UK in coalition with European embassies trying to project itself. Now that's a good luck story. British foreign policy is going through a transition. As we know, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office is merging with DFID, the Overseas Development Office. That's going to be very knocking the oxygen out. The departure from the EU, combined with the UK government's haphazard, contradictory, and probably incompetent response to COVID, is also raising doubts about this current administration and its strategic vision to do with anything. And we're heading towards a no-deal Brexit, which I think will be incredibly destructive. So against that background, with I think an incredibly effective and well-functioning embassy, British embassy on the ground in Baghdad, one wonders what leadership it will get. Though I must add, to be fair, if you speak to senior conservative politicians. They will stress and continue to stress their commitment to Iraq because of historic ties, both 2003, but all the way back to 1920. So that does count for something. I just wonder how, or if at all, it will be operationalized in the kind of strategic vision that both Maria and Sajad were talking about. My last thought before we disappear, and we're a little bit over time, is the relationship with the GCC, which is much, this is not saying much because it was low bar before, but it's much better than it has been. The Kuwait held the Reconstruction Conference. The current Prime Minister, Mustafa Kadhimi, has got very good relations with Riyadh. The United Arab Emirates realize that can have begun to see Iraq as not just or even primarily an arena to struggle with Iran against. So there is potential there. And we note that Ali Alawi, the Minister of Finance, has been to the Gulf and has tried to interest them in investment. But again, as everyone will now know, as they've been encouraged to read Sajad's report, the Iraqi system and especially its economy is in such a gargantuan mess that you can't sell Iraq to the GCC as a coherent and viable vehicle for investment. You've got to sell it, especially to Kuwait, who I think powerfully realizes this as a potential source of instability. And that's how you bring the GCC in, playing to their own interests, saying that it's not simply or even primarily for them competition against Iran, but it's stabilizing their big Iraq as a neighbor through investing in institutions' capacity and reforms.
Thank you very much, Toby. Well, on that somewhat of a positive note in terms of the relationships having improved and a real good range of ideas on the role that Europe can play going forward. Let me thank you, Maria, Toby, and Sajad, for your time and great insight today. Thank you to our attendees in Zoom and to those watching on Facebook. Please do read Sajad's paper and provide us with feedback. We'd love to get your thoughts on this as we move forward with our future Iraq work. Let me also thank my colleagues Edin Dirovic and Kelly Patello for their help today in organizing this meeting. And as ECFR MENA program, we look forward to welcoming you all in the near future for another webinar on the region. Thank you very much and good day to you all.